Popcorn Therapy, holistic health and wellness through the lens of pop culture. I'm Julie Peters. I'm a counseling therapist, a tarot reader, a writer, and a witch. I love to think deeply about pop culture and find out what our stories can tell us about who we are as individuals and as a culture, spiritually, psychologically, physically, and in all kinds of other ways. If you like that too, you are in the right place. Welcome to Popcorn Therapy. Welcome back, everybody, to Popcorn Therapy. Emilee Nimetz and I are going to be talking about Netflix's You today. And before we get started, I wanted to share with you that the book that I've been talking about on this show, a little bit here and there, is finally about to come out. So I've written this book all about divine feminine figures. They are goddesses, figures from folklore, mythology, things like that. Some you probably know, some you may never have heard of before. We've got the Greek Persephone, the indigenous Sky Woman. We've got Eve from the Bible, Lilith from Hebrew mythology. There's so many different ones. Baba Yaga from the Slavic perspective. They're so cool. And in each of the chapters, you get the story. It's kind of like bedtime stories for adults sort of thing, a little bit history and context. And each of the chapters is illustrated absolutely beautifully by Nadia Marash. So each one has a gorgeous goddess image associated with it. It's going to be a beautiful book. It's going to be a fantastic gift. And it's the first in a series. So the second one is actually coming out in October, November of this year. So Maiden, Warrior, Mother, Crone is the name of the first one, and you can pre-order it now. On June 7th, 2025, I'm going to be having a special exclusive pre-order event. So if you've pre-ordered the book, all you have to do is email me like a screenshot, a receipt, something like that proves that you've pre-ordered the book. And you can join me for an online event where I'm going to read one of the stories and we're going to have a live discussion, a little guided meditation, stuff like that. If you happen to be in Edmonton, Alberta, I'm going to be doing the book launch party on June 20th, 2025 at the Art of Cake, which is in Oliver Square. And we're going to have cocktails, we're going to have snacks. I'm going to read a different story from the one in the pre-order event. We're going to chat, have a good time, bring a date, bring a friend, celebrate. It should be great. And the official release of Maiden, Warrior, Mother, Crone is going to be on July 1st. So you should get it around then if you've pre-ordered it. I will also have some physical copies for sale and to sign so you can get all your gifts there and so on, if you want to. So I would love to have you at those events. I would love for you to check out my book. Wherever you get it, you can get it at any bookstore. And if you leave a review on Amazon, that just helps with the algorithm of things. So I would really appreciate your support in doing that. So feel free to check out Maiden, Warrior, Mother, Crone. Literally just Google it, look for it wherever with my name. And if you want to go to my website, which is juliepeters.ca/events, you'll see more about the pre-order exclusive event and the book launch party on that page, juliepeters.ca/events. Okay, welcome back to the podcast, Popcorn Therapy, with me and Emilee Nimetz, who is unofficial co-host here lots of the time, because it's you and me, Emilee, usually texting about whatever we're watching, and then we just have to talk about it. And last time we did a podcast, my baby was about 4 days old, and now he's about a month old, and I'm still not wearing makeup or what is my hair doing? We won't worry too much about it. This is just what it is.
It's just what it is.
I'm not ready to put makeup on yet. I thought about it and I decided not to.
No, absolutely not. No need.
So we are here today to talk about Netflix's You, the show You. I feel like it's hard to say you in conversation because it's just that word. And I want to introduce Emilee again. And I thought I'd introduce you with a question for you, Emilee.
Okay, great.
So Emilee is an actor, among other things, wonderful writer, wonderful poet. And what I was thinking about earlier today, as I was thinking about getting ready to do this podcast today, is I find that Emilee, you often don't talk too much about your actor stuff. And there's like stuff happening, like you're in stuff, like there's things going on. And I feel like you could be talking about it a little bit more, and you don't so much. And I kind of was remembering too, like during COVID, you were doing this thing on Instagram that was called Apocalypse Later Fashion Now. And for those of you that don't yet follow Emilee on social media, they do lots of really cool, like non-binary gender play fashion stuff, which is really enjoyable, I think. And yet, doesn't, you're not showing it too much to people. You're not being super like out there with it. And so I was curious because so much of this show, I think all of the seasons, but maybe especially this last one, is about like what we show to the world, what we don't show to the world, hidden parts of ourselves, the narrative of who we are, and all of that kind of stuff. So I was curious why, when I'm saying, what do you want to share with people, why you don't say too much, or like why, those parts of you are hidden in some ways and shared in other ways. I was just curious if you wanted to talk a little bit about that.
Oh, that's such an interesting question. Yes.
Just coming in with the hard-hitting questions.
Yeah,
right
yeah. This is journalism right now.
Exactly, it's journalism.
I think part of it is like, yes, I am an actor. I have things going on at times. I don't have a lot of things going on at other times. And so I feel like I sort of keep the promotional thing a little bit separate. So it's definitely like a big part of myself. But in terms of my public persona, I don't necessarily, that's not necessarily the thing that I'm presenting to the audience. And it's always like a delicate balance of like, what are you sharing with the public versus what are you sharing with your friends and your close circle, versus like what's just for yourself, I think also as like a queer person, as a trans person, there's a big thing, especially right now. We obviously both live in Canada. Questions of crossing the border are kind of scary for a lot of us, someone like me, because of my public persona, of how vocal I am for certain issues, how public I am about my trans identity. These kinds of things all play into that as well. So yeah, there's a bit of like, what am I putting out to the general public?
Yeah, so I mean, it's making me think about myself in that way too, because in certain ways I'm also a public figure. In different ways from acting. I'm not that kind of celebrity. But I have published books. Even just recently, I sent out a newsletter telling the story, my fertility journey, like telling the story of what's happened for me. And I'm very open about that and many other things. And I often get the question of like, wow, how do you do that? Or like, you're so brave, to share these things about yourself. And, it's interesting because for me, there was this metaphor that I got ages ago, which is this idea of bees making honey. That the way a bee makes honey is they go and they take the pollen or the nectar from the flowers, and then they digest that, and then they bring it back to the hive and they barf it out, and then they eat the barf, I think, and then they barf it out again. And like that's actually how honey is made. Is like it's bee barf over and over and over again.
Delicious.
And I once got the advice that, make sure you're not sharing something until it's honey. Like make sure that you've processed it and thought about it and digested it before you share it. And I feel like everything I share is something that has become honey. It's not barf anymore. It's something that I've really thought about and processed to the point where I'm totally comfortable sharing it, because I'm open to any questions anybody has about it. If I'm still processing something and I feel too tender about it, those are things I don't share publicly, right? So, there are parts of me that are quite public and parts of me that are private. And of course that changes because again, you and I were in the poetry community for a while, and like poems are often I've had sexual poems. I've had poems about, boyfriends I've had in the poetry community that like weren't named, of course, but, there would be things that people could think about my life or, make judgments about me or whatever it is. And there's obviously values that you express. It is coming down to this idea of how am I sharing, with whom, and what are the consequences of that going to be? And I do often think about when I'm writing a newsletter or an article for spirituality and health, or even the books I write. I mean, I have one of my books is about my recovery from sexual assault, and it's basically a memoir. It's very personal. Like I talk about masturbation in that book. Like there's like if you really want to know about me at that specific point in my life, you can find some things out about me from that book. And it's interesting because that's now an artifact of a certain time in my life, like before I'd had children, before I got married, all of those things. And I've changed, and some of my values and thinking have changed, and so on. And so it's interesting to have this sort of physical piece of writing that's just concrete, that exists in this way, that like I change as a living being and that book doesn't. I think it's just an interesting question to look at that. And, again, to think about it in terms of Joe Goldberg and you, pieces from the past coming back to haunt you, defining yourself differently, his identity changes literally and internally, like over the course of the show. In some ways, and in other ways it doesn't, right? But there was a time I was in the newspaper because for a while I made my yoga after when Trump was first elected. I made my yoga studio a Trump-free zone for a while. And it must have been a slow news week, because like the news really was very interested in this, and I had a sign on the door, and it was just something like, let's just keep this conversation out of this room. And I wasn't trying to say anything political necessarily, aside from like, let's just let this be one space where we're just not continuing to have that conversation, because at the time people kind of couldn't shut up about it, and everyone's nervous system was so keyed up. And like the CBC interviewed me and like all this stuff, and I got so much hate online. Like people left like negative star reviews for my yoga studio who lived in the US and had never been to my yoga studio because they were so mad at me for creating a Trump-free zone. So anyway, you never know what you're going to get famous for, and like how much trouble you're going to get in. Yeah. And that's Joe's experience, is that he's so meticulous about how he is expressing the narrative of who he is, and that he succeeds through a lot of the seasons of You, and ultimately, of course, fails, and maybe not at the same time at the very end of the show.
It's making me think of a time when I did a poem of something that, as you're talking about, turned to honey for me, like a personal experience. And somebody approached me very presumptively and was like, let me come and debrief with me about this. And I was like, I'm an actor. This, thing that I talked about happened to me a long time ago. I've been in therapy. I've processed it. That is why I'm sharing it. And I think, there's like a whole conversation around that can be brought up as well. But as you're talking about that, I'm like, it really reminds me of like, sometimes it's like, wow, I'm a really good actor. Cause like people out here convinced that like I'm experiencing those emotions for real. And, there's something to be said that sometimes our nervous systems don't know and blah, blah, blah. But like, I felt very like, kind of like, that's none of your business. Like, it clearly impacted you, but like, I just felt very like, okay, like this is my persona on stage. It has nothing to do with like, what I'm going through. And also, I don't know you. I'm not going to talk to you about my personal experience with this particular subject, which is like very vulnerable. I felt very it was like very weird for that person to just, who I had never met before, just like come up to me and be like, I think like taking psychology classes and I'm doing an MA in counseling and I can talk to you right now. And I was like, cool, no thank you. Like I'm actually good. Like I have a therapist. I pay them hundreds of dollars to talk about this. So
I remember that, actually. Yeah, I remember that person, and I remember that conversation, and similar things happening to me too, where a lot of the poetry that I would write would be about love and sex and romance and things like that. And somebody came up to me at one point and was like, I'm worried that you're obsessed with like this lover or whatever. And I was like, so it's like, I have a whole life that's not poems I write, right? Yeah. Like it was just like, I write about love and so on. But that's not like you have a whole picture of me inside your head based on these things that I've written, but that's not the whole of me. That's not who I am, right?
Yeah, totally. It's bringing it to Joe Goldberg and this whole question. I think what's interesting is that this is a person who is, I think, like deluded into thinking that the persona that they are presenting, this person who is so caring for women and so and is a white knight and is going to be their savior. Like this is a person who is deluded into thinking that that's true and believes that like the acts of violence that he commits are like required in the moment, and he excuses himself. He never faces the reality of causing harm to somebody else. And I think it's interesting in this last season how we really see him integrating those kinds of things, because in season 4 it gets disconnected, it gets deintegrated. He develops this, dissociated identity disorder almost. And then it comes back in this last season, and he's like, people will love me for me, which is a killer. And I am doing that out of love, and she will understand me that I'm killing because I love. And so it's interesting to see him be so deluded into thinking, you know, that is who I am. It's just who I am. And it's just the truth. And you have to love all of me. It's like these very dangerous therapy things that it's like, dude, you're killing somebody. It's, I think, very, in an extreme way, it's like really symptomatic of these kinds of cycles of abuse having, that is like so real that somebody's like presents you with the facts, like you have killed these people or you've caused this kind of harm. And there's just this very, very strong rejection of that, so much so that you do these mental gymnastics to turn yourself into the good guy in that scenario. And I think that that's like really, really accurate to how a lot of the time this plays out in like intimate partner violence, specifically when it's like men enacting violence towards women a lot of the time.
Yeah. So, spoilers ahead, for the whole show. It's like finale of the finale, right? We've got Joe, who is someone who had abuse in his childhood. He's someone who, saw violence, like experienced violence against his mother, and then he enacted violence against her abuser, and then that freaked her out. She rejected him, abandoned him. He was orphaned, brought up in part by the bookstore owner who left him in a cage, to punish him for however long. So he's someone who comes from an abusive place. He's someone who's experienced trauma. And we get a lot of him narrating what's happening in his head. And I saw a reel on Instagram or TikTok that was so funny about like what it would look like if you were watching the show without Joe's inner narrative. And it's just Joe being like like these long silences where nothing is happening. And you don't think about that because you're listening to the inner narrative and so on. So there's a lot of him narrativizing what's happening. And I kind of remember in the first season, there was social media was a big part of it. So he would stalk Beck on social media and he made all kinds of judgments about her and who she was and what she cared about and all those things. And his judgments would change and they would always be self-justified. So there was a lot of like him justifying why he would make those judgments, whatever it is. In one of the seasons, one of the women actually gets away because I feel like we're sort of in a cycle of like any woman he falls in love with ends up dead. And I feel like in the final season, they do a lot of self-conscious calling back to that, like pulling the narrative all together in those ways. There's a moment when Bronte, who's his love interest in the final season, she says, "Do I make it out of this alive?" Like, even in that moment where she's still sort of pretending that they're in love and she's aware of what's going on, she asks him, "Do I make it out of this alive? Like, does this narrative ever end with someone surviving?" Right. But in the final season, we have the reckoning for Joe, I think. And then he's going through the final season with a lot of processing around this part of himself and what this part of himself means. And he comes to a place of acceptance with it. And as you said, he is wanting an experience where he can be loved by someone who can see the killer part of him and love that as a part of who he is, because what he says is he accepts that part of himself. I feel like the tension of the show that I found so interesting, or one of the tensions of the show, is, do we love or hate Joe Goldberg? Is he a good or a bad guy? Right. And the show uses social media, and I loved the way that they called that back and really pulled it in the final season, because we, again, as we often talk about, we have that paratext of how people are talking about the show online, right? That we're also consuming at the same time as consuming the show. And so many people online are in love with Joe Goldberg. They think he's so hot. I mean, Penn Badgley is hot, of course, like he's an attractive man, but people like Joe Goldberg, like they find him to be very attractive, very romantic, and the character of Joe Goldberg is expressing a lot of romantic tropes that we see in romance novels and things like that. And I feel like that's a lot of what the first season was about. And what I found so compelling about it is that here's someone who is expressing, the kind of romantic hero that we would see in these romance novels, And of course he's a killer. Of course he has violence in him, because that's often what we see, in those narratives about, Twilight and 50 Shades of Grey and all that stuff. Like, there is this undertone of violence around this. So, I feel like that tension came to a conclusion in the finale in an interesting way. But I do think throughout the whole show, you're aligning with Joe. You're on his side. Like, you're kind of rooting for him, even as he's killing people. Sometimes it's like pulling the viewer in a way that I loved in the show, and that's why it's called You, because it's about you, actually, the viewer, and that's sort of how the story ends as well.
Totally. And I think that it was interesting how throughout the seasons, and you're right, like people, it's kind of this romantic fantasy about a serial killer, which is like a really interesting, pitch for a show. And obviously it works. And I think that the way that it resolves itself in the end is like so great, because it actually completely, without any question, reflects back on the viewer and is like, do you understand like what we're accepting about people and what we're excusing about people? I think going into season 4 was maybe Drew Barrymore like had that glass cage brought on her show, and she was like placed in it, and then
right.
I don't know if he like comes and she's like crying because she's like obsessed with being in this cage, and I'm like, the culture, like we are so broken, like
yeah. And Penn Badgley has a few clips where he's like, guys, no, stop
he's a
wanting
murderer.
Yeah. It's like, he has these interviews where he's like, I'm very conflicted about playing Joe because he is a killer, he's a bad guy. And like, he's sort of disturbed by, how many people are wanting to get in the cage with him, in that Drew Barrymore kind of way. Yeah, so I think, I love the narrative style that the show uses. And I was noticing in the final season how You is usually the woman that Joe is attracted to. Usually in his narrative, and then you appeared in my life, and you are this amazing woman that I'm so in love with, and all these things, using this kind of very romance language, obsessive, essentially, rhetoric. But the you changed at the beginning of season 5 to himself. So he was actually talking about himself in season 5, which I don't think he had ever done before, but he was saying, you are the luckiest guy in New York. You are married to this, wonderful woman, and all of these things. And then partway through the season, the you changed to being Bronte, and then Bronte became the narrator. So she actually started to, it's like the lens through which we were observing kept switching in season 5 in an interesting way. And I think, yeah, to sort of take that from the dissociative episodes of season 4 and moving them into season 5 in a way where, okay, who are we looking at? Who's telling the story, right?
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think in every season there is one episode where we do get the perspective of the woman. Like there's the episode in season 1 where we get Beck's perspective, and I think she only gets maybe half an episode before it switches back to Joe's narration. In season 2 with Love, I think we get it. Victoria Pedretti. Oh my gosh, I'm obsessed with her. Like, I'm sad that she didn't come back, but obviously she did in spirit. But she didn't, make an appearance in this last season, which I was like, oh, I need my girl. I need my girl back. Love an aggressive woman, you know me. But I think that she has one where she talks.
She's a killer, right? Right, Emilee?
And see, that's like, on gay rights. Sequel.
Female serial killers can be hot too, okay?
Yeah, okay. That's on gender equality. Men really had the market cornered on that one.
There's also a couple of moments actually in season 5 where they talk about voice. So it turns out that Bronte has been stalking Joe essentially because she knew Beck and like wants to avenge what happened to her. And it's interesting because I texted you early on in the season being like, I suspect that Bronte is up to something. And the reason I suspected that was because she was so romance cliche. You know, it was like it was a little too on the nose. And of course, Joe fell for that because, that's how his mind works. Like he's sort of living in a romance novel, I guess, all the time.
Yeah.
And she just played right into his hands in that way. And I was like, there's something about this that's like, there must be a little more to the story. And it turned out, yes, she was playing him. But what I thought was really interesting is that the thing she really wanted him to do was redact his edits to Beck's book.
Mm-hmm.
Because she wanted, and she used language something like, you took her voice away and you're going to give it back now. And I think Nadia, who was falsely put in prison for the politician Reese's murder in season 4, she also says something about, you took my voice away, because I think it was that she was so afraid to speak out because she thought he would come and kill her whole family, basically, if she did that. So she couldn't even defend herself. And so I think there was something interesting too about this idea of Joe not only murdering the bodies of these women, but also taking away their voice, which is, metaphorically like what I feel like so many women and feminine people have experienced, especially in terms of, maybe having been sexually assaulted or whatever it is, seeing, public trials against rapists and finding that, everyone sides with the, white man, which Joe names himself actually at a certain point, I think in season 5, He says something like, I always get away with it because I'm the white man, or like, you guys just love a white man, or something, in terms of like how he's always getting away with this. And that's what's been happening, right, for such a long period of time. And like, hopefully that is changing, but it's often the voice that is stolen that feels, that it's the erasure, right, that feels so powerful.
Yeah. Oh, I loved that. Like I loved that being such a key part of it for Bronte, and I loved it being such a strong, palpable like metaphor for the experience of like sexual assault and any kind of violation from men. It really, it's really real. It's like you lose this ability to kind of understand yourself and all of that. And it makes me think of I don't know the details of this, but I do just know like a tidbit where with the in Canada we had very similarly to the sort of Cosby Weinstein thing, we had our own situation in Canadian media with John Gameshi, who was on trial for sexual assault. And because of the ways in which the victims of that were treated in those court proceedings, they actually enacted new laws that would better protect victims of sexual assault. But there were, there were significant changes because they saw the ways in which the court system was like traumatizing these women for telling their story and their experiences. And um, it's really interesting to think about that. And that's part of it too, is like a lot of the times, like what you're saying is like you witness the way the media and the public attacks the women or the victims of sexual assault. And that is a tool for silence, is your voice being taken away and not being able to tell your story. And it's like a lot of the time that's why people don't press charges on those things, because they're like, I don't want somebody else to kind of take control of this narrative. Like I want to hold on to what I know is true and get through it in my own way without the court systems. And obviously that's complicated because you don't want somebody to go on and continue to commit harm, but it's a personal experience for everybody who survived those kinds of things, that we have a way to kind of take ownership of our story, because that's how you get your power back.
I think another just perspective that I kind of want to bring around this tension of, is Joe a good guy or not, is IFS. So internal family systems is a style of therapy that some of you might have heard of before. There's a book about it called No Bad Parts by Richard Schwartz, who's the founder of IFS therapy. And I love this perspective. It's basically the idea that we have many different parts within ourselves that can sometimes have different opinions. They can be at odds with each other. Different things can exist at the same time. And Dick Schwartz's perspective is so radically compassionate, I think. And it's encapsulated in the name of his book, which is No Bad Parts. And so in that book, which I highly recommend, he talks about his work with murderers and pedophiles and like the most difficult people to work with in the world. He was able to work with those people in such a way that he could see that there was that murderer part of them, but that wasn't the whole of who they were. And of course, inevitably, he would discover that the part of them that was behaving in that way, he would call a firefighter. And the firefighters are parts that are, doing anything they can to avoid feeling the pain that sits underneath, whatever it is, the pain and the shame. And so, he was able to come from this perspective of like, why were you doing that? Like, where does that come from? And kind of see the human being underneath that. And that doesn't mean he's condoning murder. That doesn't mean that like that makes that behavior okay. It's more so just coming to understand where that's coming from. I can't remember really the other seasons well enough to remember if they used this kind of languaging in previous seasons, but that was the kind of languaging that they often used throughout season 5, where Joe talked about this part of himself. Like that's kind of how he named it. It was so interesting watching Bronte go from, I'm going to take down this guy. I'm sure he murdered my friend. He's a bad person, to getting to know him and falling in love with him and flip-flopping really between, is this a human being that is flawed and has trauma and that I love, or is this just like a wholly bad person that I need to get away from? And she shifted many times, between those perspectives. And I think that matters because ultimately I agree with Richard Schwartz that, there's a human being underneath whatever the behavior is, right? And again, that doesn't make the behavior okay, but we can see like what's sitting underneath that. And there is so much of this narrative around Joe wanting to be loved for all of his parts. And what does that mean? And, he's kind of contending with the part of him that kills. And I think in season 1, we see more ambivalence from him around it, because I think we're seeing, the first killings that he does, in even the first couple of seasons, like we see him throw up at a certain point. We see him feeling really guilty about it. Like he has a lot more ambivalence about what's going on. And by the end, he's saying, I enjoy doing this. I get thrill from doing this. And I accept that about myself. And so he's kind of in relationship with that part of himself and trying to figure out how to love that part, I guess. And I mean, I think this can get very complex because I think you can love a person or a part without condoning the behavior that they're doing, right? And I think that Bronte has a moment where, she learns about all the killing and whatever it is, and she says something like, Joe, you don't have to kill in order to earn love anymore. Like that's what she sees as where that killing part is coming from. I think that's a good guess, right? That, killing to earn love, yeah, it fits into the white knight thing. It fits into the romance narrative thing. It fits into the Twilight, version of love and romance, which is, this person is very capable of violence and would kill for you, that sort of romantic cliche of I would kill for you, I would die for you. Joe kind of makes that literal. And so, she says something like that. But, as a therapist watching that part, I'm thinking, okay, she's got it in the sense that, yes, there is something underneath that part of him. There is a reason that part of him is acting out in that way. But it's not, or not only to earn love, it's also to probably like eradicate the shame that he fears for having killed that first person, or, whatever narratives were happening inside of his head when he was observing his mom being abused and, or when she left him and abandoned him, like all of those things, those would bring up really, really difficult emotions for a child, especially. And I'm talking about Joe as if he's a real person. He's not, but if he were, these are just some of the ways that you could think about it. So, there is something happening there, but the mistake that Bronte makes is thinking that fixed him, right? Thinking that solved him, just to say, I love you, therefore you don't need to do this anymore. Like firefighters they're not like, what are you talking about? I've been here for 25 years or like however old the person is. And I'm not just gonna go away now. Like he needs me, to be here. So it would take a lot more work than that, And I think the other piece that was really fascinating, and I saw this happening on social media too, where there were a lot of people that were upset about the idea of Joe needing Bronte to love him for those parts, when love not only did love him for his killer parts, but met those parts.
Yeah.
And so people were upset, saying like, you had what you're asking for. Like you're asking for, I want someone to love me for all of that, and I want to see that in them too. Like when he had Bronte, he had the guy in the cage that had been stalking her, and he wanted her to choose to kill him. he was wanting, that was like the test, is he wanted her to have that. And, she decided not to, and he went ahead and killed him anyway. So, he had what he had been asking for with love. But from a therapy perspective, of course that wasn't going to be enough for him, because love, when you have that belief within yourself that you're unlovable, no one's going to change your mind, right? Like the feeling of being unlovable is not logical. It's not a rational feeling. And so if someone tries to love you, that part is going to say, well, there must be something wrong with you then. Right. And I've had that experience, I'm not a murderer, but I've had that experience where, someone who is too loving towards me makes me recoil a little bit, because it's like, what do you mean? Like, you must not understand me then. Or if you do understand me, then you're the weird one. Right. And so love was not only, loving him for those parts, but he was mirroring him. She was mirroring him. Right. And so he was seeing his, difficult parts reflected in her. So of course he couldn't love her. Of course she wasn't going to be the person, that he could be with forever, because it was too close, actually. He needed the fantasy. It couldn't be reality. That was never going to be possible for Joe, right? Because the fantasy is essentially, and again, I'm therapizing a fictional character here. But the fantasy was where he would have needed to live, because reality was far too painful of a place for that little child that never got any support or therapy. But yeah, I think it's just interesting to think about it from that perspective of like, if you were a real person and this were a real part, there's rehabilitation that's possible for that, alongside appropriate consequences. But, he's not going to solve it from a fairy tale romance with like the manic pixie dream girl that just like falls into his bookstore and loves reading too. Right.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. There's so much there. It really makes me think of the book I Don't Want to Talk About It by, what's his name? Terrence
Real, and my
Real.
darling husband, who I always talk about on this podcast. And I mentioned that we were going to be doing this one, and he was like, okay, well, I'm not going to listen to that one because I haven't watched you, so you can talk shit about me if you want to. And I was like, I never do. But I have to talk about him now because you bring up that book. So the other day he was like, I want you to recommend a book for me, and I want to do a book report on it. Like, let's have a book that we're talking about. And I was like, I love that idea. What book should I get you to read? And I was like, it's got to be I Don't Want to Talk About It by Terrence Real, which is such a good book about covert male depression and masculinity in general. And he's just like a wonderful writer and therapist that has a lot to say about gender dynamics. So anyway, please go on. I just had to add that sidebar.
Yes. Oh my gosh. I know it's one of the books that I, would recommend to anybody in a heartbeat, especially folks who are men and who are cisgender, typically probably heterosexual men as well. So it makes me think of that, because a lot of what Terrence Real sort of like theorizes in that book and his practice as a therapist working with men is like these really extreme ways that men act out through violence or through alcoholism, through suicide. There's this big conversation that happens in the red pill space of the internet where men will sort of say, well, men have higher suicide rates, so men are, like, you need to, I guess, just shut up and be their wife, or whatever their argument on that is. But there are high suicide rates among men, and there is this conversation in I Don't Want to Talk About It, the Terrence Real book, where he talks about how men, like women don't have fewer suicide attempts. They just maybe don't do such extreme forms of suicide attempts, so where a man might like shoot himself in the head, a woman might take pills and then be revived or whatever. For example, it's not like that's not a real binary, but it's just like as an example. And we could do a whole podcast just on that book, which we won't do right now. But it makes me think of that because, it's like this really extreme way that men and people in general, I think, try to avoid feeling. Like feeling feelings is a tremendously painful thing when you've been through trauma. Like it's a scary thing to do. And we were talking about how I don't talk much about my acting practice, but to talk about it for a second, like one of the things that I worked with this coach for a period of time where the whole point of the class was to just sit in your body in the present, allow any feelings to come up. And as somebody who has like a pretty complex PTSD, a pretty complicated traumatic childhood, to sit there and just feel my feelings was kind of a revolution in and of itself. Like, I can go to talk therapy, and I've been to talk therapy, and I just talk, and analyze, and I know everything about my story, and I can explain it to you. And, through the help of many great therapists, but also just through my lived experience. And I really understand, the story, the narratives behind it. But to just be in the body and just allow the body to process the emotion is this profoundly terrifying thing. And it's really interesting to think of like this character, but like a lot of the time, men in this way, like not as a way to gain sympathy and excuse the behavior, but just as a way to understand that it's like, right, these are people who socially are not encouraged to feel their feelings or express them or to share them in any way. But also,
like on pain of death to a certain degree, right? I mean, like little
absolutely.
boys are socialized early not to express
Yeah.
their, tears, even their grief. Like, yeah, it's suppression from such an early age in
Yeah.
a more extreme way than it is for women, where there's people socialized as women. There's a different story there, but it can feel like you could be bullied, you could be beat up for that. Like, I think it gets more and more severe as boys become teens and so on. Like, it's actually quite a survival thing to suppress emotions for many,
Totally.
many people socialized as men. Yeah.
And you see the ways in which, for example, like gay cisgender men experience a lot of that ostracization, violence within their communities of like boys, where it's like a lot of young boys growing up who are gay or just even expressing parts of their femininity get extremely bullied for that. So men who are maybe not gay, but who are watching it from the outside as perhaps bystanders or participants, they witness the ways in which the expression of emotion or femininity or anything that is beyond the pale of like capital M masculinity, they witness the consequences that has. And so they internalize that. And and it just becomes this like really, really vicious cycle.
Yeah, I'll just add as you're talking about that there's a bit of a binary with disordered eating too that I find really interesting,
Mm,
where it's internalization versus externalization, right? So like people socialized as men are socialized to externalize, right? To blame others, to express in violence, like all of those things. And people socialized as women are taught to keep it all inside, swallow it down, protect other people from the feelings. So it might actually even be, and I don't want to talk about it, where he says something like, there's a reason why there are so many more women who have eating disorders and men who have alcoholism, because alcoholism lowers your inhibitions and allows you to speak. It allows you to talk about your feelings or like
mm,
express or get angry or whatever it is in a way where later you can say, I don't remember, I blacked out, or like, oh, I was so drunk, it doesn't matter. You get those drunk texts or whatever it is. It's like, a part that's been exiled, from an IFS perspective, can pop through when someone is drunk because the inhibitions are lowered. Whereas using food either to swallow down or to purge out or to restrict, all of those things are kind of like numbing, quiet, shut your mouth, like don't speak, right? Put the food in
mm.
or to get the food out or whatever it is. Like women, it's often this thing of like, I have to keep taking care of everyone around me. I cannot express those things. And so I inhibit by using food in these different ways. Whereas alcoholism does the opposite. So anyway, I think that might be dated information, but I thought it was kind of an interesting thing to think like there's a reason why there's a gender association with disordered eating versus substance use.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Okay. So we see this thing where it's like he's kind of circling the point. Bronte is kind of like it's like walking straight into the point and still missing it. Like we're seeing these things of like we're almost getting there. And then but the delusion and the fantasy is paramount and becomes like it has to take over because we're trying to do this like avoiding of the feeling, avoiding of the reflection of self, whatever it is, right? We don't want to contend with what we've done or how we've behaved. So it kind of almost gets there and then it comes right back. And it makes me think a lot of, and you'll probably have some insight to this as well as a therapist, but there is something within the I don't know if they would consider themselves a community, but the fuckboy community, where men will take this therapy speak and sort of use it as a way to get people to sleep with them and to sort of like again, walking directly into the point and missing it, like, yeah, like it's great to have that vocabulary, but like unless you're actually actively like applying it to yourself, it's still like really, really toxic and bad. And it makes me think of this one situation that I've told you about before, but where I was dating somebody, cisgender heterosexual dude, who told me that he had I was upset with something that he was doing, and basically trying to like exert a boundary and say like, I like, this is like what you're doing, how you're doing this is how it affects me, and so like unless you're going to do XYZ, like, it wasn't like an ultimatum, but it was kind of like we were at a bit of a breaking point, and it was just like, okay, this behavior hasn't changed and it's really affecting me and it's really negative, and like this is what I need from this relationship. Like essentially asserting a boundary, saying like, I like the way that you're behaving, it can't happen anymore. Like I can't be with you if it continues to happen. And the response that I got was essentially, well, I have rejection sensitivity disorder. And if you um, if you're rejecting me, that's ableism, is essentially what I was told. And I was like, no,
Oh
like,
no.
it's like, hey, whoa. Like, let's just like put a pin in that, because like, if I were to say you have rejection sensitivity disorder and that is why I don't like you or want to be with you, and I'm discriminating against you specifically because of that, yeah, maybe we could say that's ableism, but me asserting a boundary is not ableism. And what a mental gymnastic backflip Simone Biles ass thing to come to that conclusion, to basically make it so that I can't say no to you. I was like, men are cooked. Men are so like the audacity to say that. And it makes me think of that, like this is Joe who's like, I was thinking a lot of that scenario and like kind of laughing because he's so like, I'm free. I just need to be free to be me, who is a killer. And if they think that I'm a killer, then I'll finally be loved. And that's all I need. And it's like, that is so wild, and it's just like, this is just who I am. And we take it or leave it. And that's what love is all actually about, is like, you accept all the dark parts of me. And it's like, a lot of the time, these diagnoses, rejection sensitivity disorder, narcissism, even, I'm sure like sociopathy or psychopathy, which is likely what Joe is kind of related to, although it might be sort of like romantic delusion. I don't know, something like that. Um, it's like we can name those things in order to effectively participate in society in ways that we don't cause harm through those things, or that we don't cause harm to ourselves or other people, right? Like, it's like, just because you have rejection sensitivity disorder does not equal you can never be told no, because that means somebody's hurting your feelings. What it means is that
That's not the
you now
conclusion.
have
Yeah.
awareness about that, so that when someone is saying no to you, you can have the tools to go, they're saying no to me. I am overly sensitive to being told no. Therefore, I have now developed these tools to understand that they're not rejecting me. I'm still worthy of love. Like, it's okay to be told no. Like, it's essentially so that you can have tools to like manage that, not as a way to prevent you from any accountability or like responding and connecting with the person in front of you. And that's kind of how I think a little bit, into an extreme amount, as Joe Goldberg is like this guy, again, fictional character, but probably, echoes a lot of similarities. A lot of people who've experienced cisgender heterosexual men. It's like, yeah, it's this like completely missing the whole thing in terms of like, yeah, you're just gonna like um be like, well, I'm a killer, so that's just what I am, and you just got to deal with that. It's like, what are you talking about? Like, you're a killer, so now you need to learn how to stop doing that because killing is bad.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, yes, rejection sensitivity syndrome or disorder, I forget exactly the name for it. Like, it's a real thing. It does happen, but it's exactly as you say. It's a tool, that diagnosis is a tool for you to understand, okay, I have a specific kind of reaction around rejection. And then knowing that, maybe you can figure out, okay, where does that come from? Like, what is that about? And when you are inevitably rejected, which is something that we need to be able to tolerate in order to like grow and, move on in society and things like that. You can have tools to think about like, okay, I know that this is something that really activates this part of me, and how can I, help myself to get through this so that I don't just completely give up and can actually like make it through the risk of being rejected. Because yeah, it is absolutely not a diagnosis that you can use to tell the people you're sleeping with they're not allowed to say no. Like that's just not that's not what that is. Um yeah, absolutely. And so I think, you know, another piece that's kind of interesting about this show in general and Joe Goldberg in particular is that his delusions, like I think delusion is probably the best word to use when we're talking about Joe. Um, that's a spectrum, right? We're all on that spectrum. We are all deluded, you know, in certain kinds of ways. We all justify our behavior. You know, I actually heard, I can't remember where I heard it, but it was something about like the whole purpose of our intellect is to make up reasons for the things that we're doing. That we don't make conscious, rational decisions about the choices we're making. We just do what we're going to do. And then our brains later say, this is why I did that. Right.
Oh.
And I think that, you know, especially when we are making mistakes or hurting someone, you know, most of us are going to have that moment of like, well, you know, I did what I had to do, or that was, you know, that was because this was more important to me, or I put this first, or whatever it is. And obviously most of us are not going around murdering people, but it's kind of the same thing, right? Is like, we all have that capacity to see ourselves as good, right? To see ourselves as the main character of our story. And so we need to be able to justify the mistakes that we're making or the dumb choices or the bad things or whatever it is to get through, you know, a life. Like I think, you know, some of my training in like Buddhism, Tantra, meditation, you know, that was where I first had that experience of sitting with an emotion and just feeling it in the body, and not intellectualizing it and therapizing it and talking about it, right? Is like, what is it like to actually be with this? I feel like it was a really key lesson for me to think about the truth that we live on narratives. Like that is how we live. We have a story of ourselves. I had a teacher, Michael Stone, who I think I've talked about before actually on this podcast, a Buddhist teacher. He says, you know, that many of us think we fear death, but what we're fearing is not actually death. It's the death of the story of ourselves. It's the death of the narrative of who we think we are. That's the fear. You know, how are people going to remember me? Or, you know, even just that sense of like, what do you mean nothing? Like, I need to sort of grip onto something in order to survive. And with a lot of Buddhist and other types of practice, you can be in a practice of letting go of the narrative. And that's the meditation practice actually, is you sit with a big feeling that you're having, you notice the narrative around the feeling, and then you try to separate the narrative from the feeling itself, like let the narrative drift to the background and just stay in what's in your body. And a lot of the time when you try to do that, the emotion won't stay if the narrative isn't there, right? Like you kind of discover that they're so connected. And so, you know, narrative therapy is another type of therapy that I find really interesting. And a lot of what you'll do in narrative therapy is look at the story you're telling and try to find, as Michael Stone would say, the stories in the margins. What are the stories that are not being told? What are the perspectives that you're not hearing about this? And, you know, Joe is very much, I am the main character. The you, whoever she is the romantic interest, the secondary character, the one that has to fit my idea of what this is supposed to look like. And so, you know, what happens at that very last scene is we see Joe in prison and he's getting these letters from women, I think mostly, who are obsessed with him, just in the same way that they are on social media obsessed with Joe Goldberg, the character. And they're writing to him these sort of sexually explicit letters and whatever it is. And he says, you know, maybe I'm not the problem. Maybe it's you. And he looks into the camera looking at us, you know, those that are in love with Joe Goldberg and whatever it is. And he's also saying society, us, like that, you know, the romance narratives that I think that the very first season, that's what it felt like is, okay, we are talking about the romance narrative, we're sending it up and we're showing what it would look like in reality, which is actually quite violent, right? And then by the end, that's what we get is, you know, Joe kind of saying, he's telling his story again, right? It's not me, it's you, right? It's like, it's society. It's not, I'm still going to avoid taking accountability, even sitting here in prison, supposed to be atoning for all of these crimes that I have certainly committed. You know, he's still not seeing it that way. He's still finding a way to shift the narrative away from that accountability. And again, from an IFS perspective, Of course he would. You would have to, right? Like, because the alternative is sitting in the shame of everything that he's done. And human beings are so wired to avoid shame at any cost. Like, we will do almost anything. And for Joe, it's killing, right? And justifying and all these things to avoid that experience of shame. Which from some perspectives is what underlies all of these pathologies we have, is our avoidance of shame, which one of my teachers defines as being witness for our badness, or what we perceive as our badness.
Oh my gosh, yeah. I think what's so great about the series overall is like the insidiousness of it. Like this is, you know, this, extremeness of killing, sure. But I think that it's like this is, especially for men, like this is a common experience for cisgender heterosexual men specifically, um, of being like telling themselves these stories that they're a good person, they're deserving of, like, I don't know, like a subservient wife or whatever it is, like the manosphere of it all. But, I think probably 2015, 16, around there was like this conversation around like the capital M, capital F male feminist, where it's like this is this person who sort of uses this language, feminist language, to kind of get involved with women and, sleep with them or whatever, as a way to manipulate. Again, like somebody who's like can read all this but isn't internalizing any of the teachings of it. And Joe Goldberg is a perfect example. And I think like it really reminds me a lot of this conversation of like intimate partner violence, and the cultural conversation around that, and like how people from the outside of those experiences often feel like, oh, like why don't you just leave? And I think that what this series really does is shows like how hard it is, because you have this person who is sometimes willing to kind of like tell you whatever they think you want to hear, and they've done a lot of stalking or a lot of just like really like examining you from this disconnected place to understand what it is you would want to hear, and they tell that to you and you believe them, and you take them at their word, and so it develops into this thing where it becomes really difficult to leave. And I think that it paints that so wonderfully. Like, that's the wrong word, but I think that it paints it accurately. That's a better word. Is like it's a very accurate portrayal of that like seduction, especially like with Bronte. We see it. It's like, yeah, she comes in being like, I'm the manic pixie dream girl, I'm so clumsy, whoopsies, I'm such a rebel. And she knows exactly the kind of person that Joe would fall for. And then he still sees her and sees what's going on for her, and he gets in there, and then she's like, wait, no, he protected me from that other guy though. Like, he protected me from him. Come on, guys. Like, can we just drop it? Like, I actually, you know, he cares about me. I can see it now. I can see why this happened to these other women. And also, just like complete side note, but I do want to address one thing, which is the baseball cap. And so I know there's a big joke online, and there has been since the beginning of the show, of like, he's just in a disguise in a baseball cap. Like, of course, he can just get away with all this, his crazy disguise. It's just a baseball cap. But I think that's intentional. And I think that it's true, because it's like men, especially white, cisgender, heterosexual men, are afforded invisibility in our culture. They can put on a fucking baseball cap and nobody can notice them. They can just cruise through life because they're so nothing that they just can go through and put on a baseball cap and be serial killer predators. It makes me think of Ted Bundy. And it's like, this is a guy who is like charming and handsome and nice, and like nobody would have expected that from him until they did. And I think that it's like, I know that there's a joke about the baseball cap, but I don't think the baseball cap is trying to be some sort of like mastermind disguise. I think it's supposed to be this intentional non-disguise that allows him to be disguised because of his invisibility. In season 1, he's like fully like masturbating across the street like it's the night, but like he's just like not hiding in a bush. Like, he's on a porch step doing that across from her apartment with no fear that he's going to get caught. And the second a person opens the door, he just tucks it away and becomes this nice guy who's like, let me hail you a taxi. And it's like, that is crazy. But that's the thing, is like, you can be completely invisible. A lot of people can just be completely,
Every
a lot of
man.
people are, and a lot of men are completely invisible. Well, maybe it's because I'm gay that I just don't notice them that much, but like, but I think that it's a worthwhile thing that I am like, no, the baseball cap is actually such a crucial piece of this, because it's like, yeah, he actually can go pretty undetected. A lot of men can, and
Mm,
it's very insidious, and that's why it is so scary, because you can't, like catch it from the beginning. You can't guess what an abusive person is going to be like. Um, they're not going to show that side to you right away. You don't just detect that from the beginning. There is a charm. There is something that seduces you about them.
absolutely. Yeah, that's how it happens, right? Is that there's something good in the relationship, right? There's love there. And I mean, I kind of remember getting the after school special lesson about domestic violence, which is like, if someone ever hits you, you just walk away. And I talked about this at length when I did a podcast on It Ends With Us, yes. So I did an extensive podcast, not about the drama of that, but about the movie itself, which depicts intimate partner violence in a way that is in some ways realistic and in other ways not. And the major problem I had with it is that, she leaves and she's like this hero for leaving and stuff. And it's often so much more complicated than that, because for many reasons, but one of them is, it starts out with the romance. It starts out with the love. Like, it starts out with the parts of that person that, you love, and also they love you in a certain way that feels important. It's, so much of the time people who get involved with narcissists, that's often how it begins, is with a lot of charm, right? And I really appreciated the conversation that Marianne and Bronte had towards the end in the final season, where Marianne says something like, you don't want it to be true because you don't want to be that cliche of someone who wasn't smart enough to see what was going on. And later, Joe is actually speaking in exactly the way that Marianne had expressed to Bronte. Like, he uses almost the exact same phrases later. And so Bronte's hearing them, maybe for the first time, and she's really noticing, like, oh, he does talk like that, and that is what's happening. And, he says something like, that's not you, you're smarter than that. And she says, no, I'm not.
Mm-hmm.
And I loved that moment, because I feel like that's so true for so many people, whether it's domestic violence or sexual assault or whatever it is. Like, I had that sense as well, as like, I should have been smarter than that. Like, that I'm ashamed that happened to me, because I should have been able to see it coming. I should have been able to avoid that, whatever it is. Like, that's the narrative that I was told, is if I'm a smart girl, if I'm aware, all of those things, then this would never happen to me, and that's some of where victim blaming comes from, is like, people don't want to believe it could happen to them. So they find a reason why it must be your fault that it happened to you. And that's something that I really had to sit with in therapy and process, that yeah, it happened to me. It happened to me. I missed it. I didn't see it coming. I trusted someone I shouldn't have. And that doesn't make me stupid or flawed. That's just what happened. The other thing that I really noticed too is when they had Dale, the guy who was stalking Bronte, in the cage. And Bronte had this long conversation with him. She found some empathy for him, his background, like where this came from, all of that. It was kind of like a moment of connection between the two of them. And then he says, I'm going to be more careful next time. And she said, next time, what do you mean? And he says something like, well, I'm going to make sure that the next woman I stalk deserves it. And you're like, okay, you've missed the point. Like,
Yeah.
Women are still not people to you, and like, maybe Bronte has become a person to you, but women shouldn't have to work so hard to become human beings in the eyes of their abusers, right? Their stalkers and so on. And I think that's some of what the show is speaking to as well, is that Joe, with all of his charm and all of his narratives and all of his things, he does not see women as human beings. He sees them as, characters in his story. He sees them as, things that he's entitled to, objects to own, and use and stalk and all those things. Like, he might think that it's this romantic thing, but, he's not gonna stick around for somebody when they're like sick or irritated. And we see some of that, I think, with him and Love, like having a child together. There were a couple of those episodes where you could kind of see like some of the stresses of being new parents that I can relate to, like it can be hard, and you're extra tired and you're irritated with each other. Like, that was never going to survive his romantic fantasy of what that was supposed to look like, right? So even if he did get what he says he wants, it would never be that way. And And I could see, I know they're not going to do another season, but like, he starts having a love letter pen pal sort of thing. And that's great for fantasy, not good for reality, right?
Yeah,
It
yeah,
would
exactly.
never work in that way.
And that's actually, yeah, that's such a thing. Like, in the era of texting and all of that is like, I've had many dates, with men, ugh, much to my behest. Um, but like where I've been like chatting with them on like Tinder or whatever, and it's like there's a good flow, there's a chemistry there, and then you meet in person and it's like no chemistry at all. And it's like, oh, like we both had an idea of what was happening on the other end of the line there. And that is not what is actually before me when we connect in person. And I think that's like probably, a real thing that doesn't always result in murder. But I think that that's a thing that a lot of men do just in
Hopefully not.
general in person. It's like, it's easy to do that when you're just chatting over text because there's so much of like the physicality that you're not picking up on. Um, but I think a lot of cisgender heterosexual men will do this where it's like they don't see you as a person. Like they just generally like you're standing in front of them and they still like cannot conceive of you like as a three-dimensional person who is deserving of you of their care, but also like who is deserving of like getting level with them, like being honest, like be honest with me. And this is the thing is like when you're a person who's put on a pedestal by a partner, it's very dehumanizing. It's very alienating. It feels good momentarily, but the second like and it can be very terrifying because like the second you sort of I've been in those situations where I'm like I have to live up to this idea that you've created of me, and the second I fall off of that pedestal, you run away because like how dare I be a human being who is like imperfect and like who doesn't, do everything that you're expecting. And
Hmm.
that is just like the danger is like I feel like so much it's so common that it's like I I see it all the time where it's like you just genuinely don't see your partner as a three-dimensional human being, and that is like it's like deeply upsetting. It's deeply upsetting and it's very real, Again, not everybody's going out killing here, but um
Yeah, and I
yeah.
feel like you and I talked about that in one of our, or maybe all of our Love is Blind episodes, because, we're looking at these people who are very much creating a fantasy of who the other one is through the wall in the pods. And it's when they actually meet in the real world that things start to fall apart, usually for most of them.
Yeah.
And I think I might have talked about Michael Stone in that one too, because his concept of love from a perspective of non-attachment is seeing someone for who they really are in that moment and allowing them to change, right? And
Mhm.
the definition of love that I talk about in my book, Want, about my recovery from sexual assault, in which I learned all this stuff about trauma and love and all kinds of stuff, and it's all in that book. But the definition I have there is something like true love is when everyone involved supports the spiritual growth of both themselves and also the other person, right? It's like letting someone grow to be who they're going to be. And so there's something really powerful about loving beyond the fantasy that you have of someone. Like,
Mm.
in some of the learning that I did in my counseling classes and so on was also about like, okay, what marriages tend to last? A lot of the marriages that tend to last will be like religious marriages, like the ones that like, stick together because there's this larger narrative of why you need to stay, right?
Mm.
It's people get together because of those fantasies of who the other is, and then they stick, if they can stick with the fantasy, they'll stick with the person, right? It's sort of like staying with the narrative. And it's a much deeper practice to be able to stay with someone who is a human being with flaws through the ebbs and flows of that, right? Like, I mean, I won't get into the whole thing, but like my husband and I have been through a lot over the last, 5-6 years with all of our fertility struggles and like becoming new parents and having miscarriages and getting through that and saying that we're not going to do it anymore and then deciding we are going to do it,
Mm.
like having another baby and all this stuff. Like, even just the hormonal changes that I've been through, the changes my body has been through, like all of these things. I feel like I've been many different people, throughout all of this, and to be able to still love someone and kind of come to a place where we're both exhausted. We snip at each other in the morning and then we just let it go and continue to love each other through the rest of the day. Like sometimes that's what real love looks like is, being able to just be like, I hate this about you. And I also love you. So forget about it. Um, and so I think, another the sort of other side of that, of what you're talking about, is like it's seeing someone and being willing to let them have flaws and not put someone on a pedestal. But the other side, the flip side of that, is allowing ourselves to be seen, right? Like, that idea of like, oh, I'm on a pedestal and now I have this anxiety because the person might witness me for my badness, right? Like I might have to feel shame if I let this person get close enough to see who I really am, and like these bad parts of me. Again, something relatable about Joe, not that the bad parts of me are murderous parts, but like maybe I have parts where like I just feel dumb sometimes, or, I make the wrong decision, or I feel ugly, or whatever it is. Like there are going to be these parts that I'm afraid of someone seeing. And I feel like that can also prevent us from being able to love genuinely, because we just want to protect those parts that we perceive as bad, even if they're not really bad. They're just like parts of being a human being. I don't think our culture is great about letting us be human beings, like maybe especially people who are socialized as women, right? Like you sent me actually, the other day a reel or something on Instagram that had like a bunch of clips from 90s magazines, that were showing like Mariah Carey's huge porky thighs. And you're just like, wow, she's very thin, like in this photo, and then, Mary-Kate Olsen has no butt. She's too skinny. And then Kate Moss is on crack. And you're like, why do you think Kate Moss is on crack? Like, it's because of this, right? And, you sent that to me with like, no wonder we all had eating disorders, like, people of the 90s, like this is what we were exposed to. And so, there's not a lot of space to be human beings in this culture. And I think the gender divide of that is, there are different things that you can say about it. Like people socialize as women. That's one thing, around body size and taking up space and voice and things like that. And with men and masculinity is this other thing around suppression and stoicism and, never expressing in a certain way and fitting into certain types of roles in society, making money. Like there are different ways, I think, that we're all conscripted to fit roles and not be actual human beings with multiplicity and space to be flawed and try things and fail and things like that. So I think it makes it really hard for us to love and be loved.
When we're talking about these things of like accountability or change or like working through our shame, it's like that is an experience that you can only have like when it's you alone, like working through your shame, feeling your feelings. That's not an experience you can have with somebody. Like you can have a therapist there with you to like support you through it and encourage you and pull you out of it if it's getting too intense or whatever. But the actual experience of the feeling is a singular one. Like it's something that only you can do. And I think we see with like Joe and people who relate to Joe and this cultural pervasiveness of maleness as told through this character of Joe is that we have this like complete unwillingness to be perfectly honest. Like he refuses even up until the bitter end to be like, I should not have done that. Like he never really says that, I don't think, at the end. Like he never really it's like it sucks that he got caught, and also how dare you turn me into this monster, It's all you who did this to me. He still is unable to say to himself, I can't believe that I did that. That is horrible. I feel really bad. And I'm going to sit with feeling really bad. I'm not going to let it overwhelm me and not be able to move through it. But like we're so avoidant at sitting in that feeling really bad. I was thinking a lot about how young people are so inundated with this like requirement to like have a certainty around their identity so young, and that's really detrimental to the to childhood development. Like when you're a teenager, you're supposed to be trying on all kinds of different things. You're supposed to be trying on being pushing back against authority, being fitting in with dominant culture, rejecting dominant culture, dyeing your hair, doing all of these, like rebelling against your parents. Like you are meant to do those things to test yourself, to understand who you are and what you value. And when you're in a place where it's like you need to brand yourself for TikTok so that you can monetize on it by the time you're 15, so that you can sell skincare that is meant for 40-year-olds to 15-year-olds, which fucking kill me, please. But like, you really lose the ability to self-reflect, and you hold so strongly to this identity that prevents you. It like the stronger you hold to it, the harder it will be to like dismantle that idea of yourself. And so when you like have this like such this declarative like stronghold of the internet that is like, I am this kind of person. I like these stories and these books. And that is, like I think a lot of millennials who are struggling a lot with like their Harry Potter love. And it's like, yeah, maybe we need to let go of that as our only identity because there's a
Right.
lot of problems with it. And it's like, how do we then, because we've held so strongly to this thing of like,
Yeah.
this is who I
You
am,
don't have to be a Hufflepuff forever.
like let go, honey. Just let go of that
You
shit.
don't have to.
You don't have to do that. J.K. Rowling is a turfy, transphobe, awful, awful person. So find another book,
She wants to sort people into houses.
Like, what are we
You don't have to be sorted.
No one is sorting you here. No one is sorting you. It's like Sex in the City. We're all four of them, okay? We're all four of them.
Yeah.
You're a slut.
Yes, you can have parts. You can have parts, right? You can have many parts. And I feel like it was such a revelation to me when I realized that you could both and.
Yes.
Right? You could feel sad and excited. You could feel anxious and, I don't know, enjoy, like whatever it is. Like you can have different feelings at the same time. And it is okay to not know. Right? Like I think that's what you're talking about is like in the social media culture where you have to name who you are and what you do and what you're influencing and all those things. It's like there's no room for you to not know or change your mind, right? God forbid you change your mind in this culture.
Oh Lord.
How can you have a useful conversation if you're never allowed to change your mind?
I think that's the crux of the matter. I think that's like where we are as a culture right now is like people who are holding so strongly to their belief systems that they're unwilling to see maybe queer people are actually okay, or like whatever it is. But I think
maybe
like,
trans people aren't trying to kill me and my family.
Yeah, like don't worry, we're just like sitting here actually having depression naps.
Not interested in you.
I have no interest in going to hang out with you or your family. Trust me.
Yeah.
Like that's not on my radar. What I'm really interested in is getting a good Americano and flirting with the barista.
That's all it is, guys.
That's really all we're about.
Yeah, so wonderful as always to talk with you about this show. I feel like we talked about, life and culture and love and all sorts of other things through the lens of this show, which was really, really wonderful. So thank you again for being willing to have this conversation with me. And for all of you listening, we want to hear your thoughts too, because we don't need to be just feeling one thing and thinking one thing. We are open to different opinions and different perspectives and so on. And that's kind of what makes this stuff interesting, right? Is being able to look at it from different perspectives. So feel free to reach out. And yeah, anything you want to plug after that whole conversation about what you're sharing and not sharing? Anything you want to be public about?
I don't really have anything going on that I can be public about right now, so
but stay tuned.
Stay tuned. There might be things coming out in the future that I can talk about, but it's certainly not right now.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Okay. So yeah, thank you so much, and we'll be back whenever we're back, and we'll talk about more stuff for Popcorn Therapy. Thanks, Emilee.
Thanks for having me. Bye.
Bye. Thanks as always, everybody, for listening to our podcast on Netflix. If you want to learn more about me and what I do, you can go to juliepeters.ca. Don't forget to check out my new book, Maiden, Warrior, Mother, Crone, coming out July 1st, 2025. And the second in the series is going to be called Witch, Healer, Priestess, Outcast, and that's going to be coming out later in this year. You'll hear more about that as more details come. It's still in its editing process. You can also leave me a tip if you want to. So this podcast I really am just doing for fun. And I do all the the prepping and editing and recording and all of that stuff. So if you feel like leaving me a tip just to say thank you or whatever it is, you can go to juliepeters.ca/tip me, and there will be a little PayPal link there where you can tip me any amount if you want to. So I appreciate your support. I also appreciate you liking, subscribing, sharing this podcast, all of those things, listening to the episodes from the past that you haven't heard before. I'm going to keep making them on some kind of schedule. I don't know. I'm still in my postpartum period, so we'll see how it goes. Maybe it'll be more because I've got time to watch movies and TV. Send me your recommendations. So thanks as always for listening, and we'll catch up with you next time.